This Siberian sled dog obviously isn't thirsty, yet it insists on occupying the only water source. The other dogs dare not speak out in anger, only the awakened buck remains unconcerned. It walks to the nearby ice surface, then strikes it with force, smashing a hole. Seeing this, the waterless dogs immediately gather joyfully. However, the Siberian sled dog shows obvious displeasure because, in its view, Buck's actions are a blatant challenge to its authority. So by evening, the Siberian sled dog begins to provoke Buck wildly. Although Buck is strong and powerful, it is a novice at fighting, because not long ago it was merely a spoiled pet dog. Buck spends every day leisurely strolling the streets or playing in its owner's luxurious mansion. Its morning wake-up service is even more unique, jumping onto the bed and lifting the owner a meter high. The servants and chefs in the kitchen feel the earth shake and quickly and orderly seal all the food in boxes to prevent Buck from sneaking in to steal. That day coincided with the birthday party of the male owner, Judge Miller, and everyone was on high alert. However, when the photographer took a family portrait, Buck was chewing on a large chicken leg, leisurely walking into the shot. Judge Miller sensed trouble and found that the lavish feast in the yard had already been completely ruined by Buck's mischief. To teach Buck a lesson, Judge Miller scolded it and, for the first time, locked Buck outside the house overnight. But Judge Miller didn't realize that this lock would become the end of his and Buck's relationship forever. Late at night, a dog thief lured Buck onto a car with delicious food. By the time Buck reacted, the car was locked and speeding away. Suddenly, a thunderstorm broke out, and after several exchanges, Buck was sold onto a speeding train. After some time, the originally dark surroundings finally welcomed a ray of sunlight. Then a stranger violently pried open the cage with a wooden stick. Out of self-preservation, Buck, now free, immediately lunged at the man but was knocked to the ground with the stick. Knowing it couldn't fight the man, Buck gave up struggling, but it didn't give up escaping. When no one was watching, it used brute force to break free, then opened the door to escape the guards and rush toward the bright exit. However, what it didn't expect was that at that moment it was on a cargo ship surrounded by ice, snow, and mountains, with no way to leave. It turned out it had been sold to icy, snow-covered Alaska. Because many gold prospectors came here out of curiosity, the place was bustling but filthy and chaotic. What made Buck from the south feel most out of place was the unique northern white snow. The icy touch made it walk in a comical way, but soon it became excited and started playing again, even breaking free from the dog leash out of joy, then darting into the crowd alone. Suddenly, it collided with an elderly man with white hair, who was in a hurry and didn't notice the harmonica that had fallen on the ground. Buck kindly chased after him to return the item. Little did they know, this act would become its salvation in the future. As the man and dog made eye contact, the dog trader from earlier arrived and took Buck to the dog market. Soon, a man named Perot, who immediately took a liking to Buck's large build, bought it without hesitation. Then they followed a large group of gold prospectors, climbing the towering ladder into the clouds, reaching the mountain top. It turned out that Perot was a mail carrier, mainly responsible for pulling a sled across 500 miles of snow to help prospectors and their families communicate through letters. Buck's natural task was to pull the sled. However, upon first seeing it, Spitz, the lead dog, recognized that Buck was a dog with a tough exterior but weak inside. After observing, Buck felt that this team was unreliable. After all, the team consisted of various breeds, and each dog looked exhausted, clearly worn out and lacking vitality. After getting to know each other, Buck was assigned to the back of the team. But Buck didn't like this position at all, and even began to consider mutiny. However, with Perot's command, everything was beyond its control. The entire sled team, led by Spitz, quickly started moving. Buck was not yet accustomed to working, but it barely kept up with the pace. During a sharp turn, a rabbit distracted Buck instantly, causing the entire team to be dragged down the slope. An irritable Spitz kept snarling and growling at it. Fortunately, Perot was reasonable. He not only didn't get angry, but also gently advised Buck to develop the team spirit. Although Buck still felt guilty deep inside, it resolutely made a vow to fulfill its duties. Soon, Buck realized that not only was there exploitation among humans and dogs, but also oppression among the dogs themselves. Whenever they ate, Spitz would take advantage of being the leader to forcibly snatch food from companions, and even when drinking water, Spitz always monopolized the water source alone. Buck, inexperienced in the sled team and unfamiliar with team rules, was excluded by Spitz the next day due to its overly friendly nature. But the strong never complain about their environment, nor fall into self-pity. Buck worked hard to improve itself and earned respect through strength. Moreover, an incident that followed made Perrault and his female companion realize that Buck not only had endurance beyond ordinary dogs, but also possessed great courage to face crises. At that time, they needed to cross an ice lake. To test if the ice was solid, the female companion carefully tested it, but unexpectedly, she slipped and fell into the bottomless water. Seeing the situation, Buck hesitated not at all and jumped into the icy water, quickly finding his female companion. Just as Buck exhausted himself trying to break the ice and rescue her safely ashore, he was unable to support himself and fell again into the dark lake bottom. Perrault was frantic, shouting loudly, but all he received in response was despairing silence. Just as Perrault was sinking into despair, Buck, who had managed to save himself silently, quietly approached him. Perrault was overwhelmed with emotion and tightly embraced Buck. However, this tender scene sparked jealousy in Spitz, who was not far away. It could not tolerate a newcomer like Buck threatening its position in the sled team. Thus, a power struggle quietly began late at night. Initially, Buck only intended to join his companions in a game of rabbit hunting, planning to release the rabbits back into the wild after catching them. But suddenly Spitz charged from the side, not only killing a rabbit with a bite, but also continuously provoking Buck. Buck had no fighting experience, so he only avoided attacks and occasionally pushed the opponent away with his body. The more Buck showed retreat, the more reckless Spitz became. Ultimately, Spitz, victorious, arrogantly looked at the other sled dogs and did not forget to kick up snow with its hind legs to assert its authority. Although Buck was essentially a dog, his heart always harbored the wildness of a wolf. Once awakened, that wolf left opponents with only despair. In an instant, the tide of battle reversed. Spitz tried to resist, but was subdued by Buck and unable to escape. As the lead dog, Spitz clearly could no longer set aside its pride and continue to coexist with Buck in the sled team. So, with its last dignity and stubbornness, Spitz disappeared toward the direction of the northern lights. The next morning, the sleeping sled dogs poked their heads out of the snowdrifts. Meanwhile, Perrault noticed that the lead dog Spitz was missing. To ensure the team could continue forward, Perrault had to select a new leader from the remaining sled dogs. However, just as Perrault made his choice, Buck moved to the front of the team. Perrault believed that, in terms of experience and overall ability, Buck was not suitable to lead the sled dogs. Therefore, Perrault pulled Buck back into place and appointed the oldest gray dog as the new leader. Unexpectedly, that gray dog refused to accept the role. It turned out that after the previous night's confrontation, Buck had established an unshakable authority among the sled dogs, becoming the recognized leader of the pack. Although Perrault was unaware of the full story, considering the need to deliver the mail on time, he ultimately relented and officially appointed Buck as the lead dog. Following Perrault's past experience, it takes at least 5 years to train a qualified sled dog leader. However, at this moment, Buck exhibits far more spirituality and talent than an ordinary sled dog. In this instant, Perrault seems to have found a rare treasure, and he cannot help but shout out loud with excitement. This shout actually triggers an avalanche. In a critical moment, he hurriedly urges Buck to turn left immediately, away from the avalanche. But Buck now has its own judgment. It keenly perceives that panicked fleeing is useless, and decisively leads the team straight toward the avalanche. Initially, Perrault thought Buck was panicked and thus reckless, risking its safety. But in an instant, they burst into a cave, using the mountain as a barrier to successfully escape. After several days of rapid travel, the sled team finally reaches their destination. Due to their high speed, they fell into a snowdrift when braking, but Perrault was extremely happy. This was the first time in his career that he delivered mail on time. Perrault, looking at the crowd eager for trust, explains to Buck, "On this desolate land, letters from afar are emotional bonds between strangers and their families. They carry not just messages, but also warmth of love and hope." The next morning, the sled team, tasked with delivering replies, prepares to leave the town. However, as the team starts, Buck suddenly brakes sharply, causing Perrault to fall to the ground. It turns out an old man hurriedly came to deliver a letter. This old man was John Thornton, who had previously met Buck. Because they missed the delivery time, Perrault initially refused to accept John Thornton's letter, but Buck voluntarily brought it over. John Thornton gratefully said, "I recognize you. Thank you for stopping for me." Since then, the sled team has become heroes of the town. Even the postal workers marvel that they managed to cover 2,400 kilometers in 80 days. Unfortunately, all things in the world are ultimately unable to withstand the erosion of the tide of history. One day, Perel received a notice from the company demanding him to immediately sell all the dogs of the sled team. With the advent of telegraph technology, the era of sled dogs delivering messages came to an end. Although filled with reluctance, Perel, a low-level employee, was unable to support this group of sled dogs. Eventually, the entire sled team was sold to Hal, a man who had once beaten Buck with a stick. Hal was a gold prospector dreaming of discovering the legendary Golden River and getting rich overnight. However, he failed to notice that the sled had already frozen in place. When he mistakenly thought the dogs were lazy, he was about to whip Buck into submission. Just then, John Thornton, passing by, stopped him in time, not only warning Hal about the abnormal condition of the sled, but also kindly reminding him that the so-called Golden River was just an unverified legend. Considering the approaching spring and the danger of melting ice and snow, John Thornton specifically warned Hal that setting out at this moment could easily cause both humans and dogs to fall into the icy depths. But Hal paid no heed, insisting on taking 2 companions and sled dogs on the journey. As the ice and snow continued to melt, even exhausted dogs could no longer slide the sled. Hal blamed the dogs' laziness, grabbing a whip and beating them, wildly venting his anger and helplessness. Buck, though utterly exhausted, couldn't bear to see his companions abused. As the lead dog, Buck believed that if he endured a little longer, his companions would suffer less. Finally, Buck used his last strength and collapsed, dying in the snow. When Hal saw that Buck was no longer useful, he drew his gun intending to shoot him. At the critical moment, John Thornton arrived just in time with a hunting rifle. It turned out that after seeing Buck leave, John Thornton had thought it over repeatedly and decided to follow. Faced with the threat of the rifle, Hal weighed the pros and cons, abandoned the conflict, left Buck behind, and continued with the remaining sled dogs. What Hal didn't expect was that night, the sled dogs would abandon him in the wilderness and escape collectively. 2 days later, Buck slowly awoke on John Thornton's bed. Initially, with fuzzy consciousness, Buck still tried to find his companions, but after seeing the melting ice, his senses gradually cleared, realizing that his companions might have already met misfortune. So Buck lifted his head to the sky and let out a mournful howl. John Thornton walked slowly toward the tavern, and not long after he sat down, Hal, unable to contain his anger, stormed in and punched John Thornton in the face. At that moment, Buck, following John Thornton's trail, witnessed the scene and immediately lunged forward to bite Hal. As chaos ensued, the town's sheriff arrived upon hearing the commotion. Since the bar explicitly prohibited weapons, Hal, who was armed, was publicly expelled onto the street by law enforcement. After everything settled, John Thornton was enveloped in a heavy sense of melancholy, and even after returning home, he kept drinking. Buck didn't understand why John Thornton was so downcast, but he thought drinking was unhealthy, so he deliberately knocked over his cup, carried the bottle outside, dug a hole, and sat on top of it. No matter how John Thornton pushed and shooed, Buck remained steadfast. Then Buck heard John Thornton murmuring that today was his son's birthday, and that he had recently died after 2 days of high fever. Since his son's death, John Thornton didn't know how to face his wife, nor could he return to the familiar environment, so he came alone to this remote place. John Thornton's son loved adventure stories and often begged his father to take him climbing into the wilderness mountains to gaze at the stars from the summit. Unfortunately, this wish was never fulfilled. The next day, while Buck was still sound asleep, John Thornton eagerly took out a map to wake it up and proposed heading to an uninhabited wilderness as a way to fulfill his beloved child's dream. So, John Thornton and Buck set out in a dugout canoe, embarking on an unknown adventure. During the day, they traveled accompanied by fish and birds. At night, they leisurely moved under the moonlight. When tired, they camped and rested, playing the harmonica to relax. One day, they suddenly encountered a swift river. Although neither human nor dog was harmed, the boat was damaged in several places, forcing John Thornton to abandon the boat and land ashore. At this moment, the sunset just happened to turn the sky red. Later, guided by Buck, they crossed through the jungle and unexpectedly discovered an abandoned wooden cabin. Thus, they settled there. The next morning, while bathing, John Thornton noticed a faint shimmer at the bottom of the river. It was the legendary Gold River, a treasure that gold prospectors spend a lifetime searching for. John Thornton immediately began gold panning, and Buck, under his guidance, joined in. When Buck returned with a large gold nugget, John Thornton was entirely focused on a small gold grain in his hand. Misunderstanding that his master preferred fine gold dust, Buck threw the large gold nugget into the river. If John Thornton had known, he would have deeply regretted it. In the following days, the master and dog both immersed themselves in the joy of gold prospecting. Until one day, Buck sensed a call from afar. After obtaining John Thornton's permission, Buck headed alone into the dense forest. Just over the hill, Buck encountered a giant brown bear. Knowing it was no match, Buck avoided its attack and turned elsewhere. At this moment, a pure white mother wolf appeared, causing Buck to feel a flutter of excitement. He was about to approach and show friendliness, but the wolf quickly fled as if offended. Deep into the night, Buck was still pondering, why were their footprints so similar, yet he was not liked? To uncover the reason, at dawn the next day, Buck sought out the white wolf again. At this moment, the white wolf was working with its companions to hunt a wild boar on the opposite bank of the river. Before they could act, the lead gray wolf suddenly slipped on the wet ground and fell into the rushing stream, being swept downstream by the swift current. Fortunately, a large dead tree was nearby, allowing it to cling to and temporarily escape danger. But if help did not arrive in time, it would eventually be dragged into the abyss once its strength was exhausted. In a critical moment, Buck suddenly charged forward, using brute force to slowly drag the entire dead tree to the shore. The gray wolf escaped danger, and Buck was thus officially accepted by the wolf pack. From then on, Buck traveled daily among the wolves, learning hunting skills for birds and carefully studying how to catch fish with its mouth. When it found food, Buck would bring it back to John Thornton, and life was incredibly happy and joyful. However, as time passed, John Thornton realized that Buck's wild nature had been thoroughly awakened. It could no longer return to the world shackled by civilization. Buck is not originally from a noisy city. The vast wilderness is its true home. Thinking of this, John Thornton suddenly felt a wave of loneliness. Since wandering until now, John Thornton had not yet found a place to rest of his own. So he resumed his old habit of drowning his sorrows in alcohol. Nightly, Buck, returning home, keenly sensed his master's abnormality and depression. Instead of overturning the wine bottle as usual, it obediently lay beside John Thornton, quietly gazing at the stars in the night sky. The next day, to cheer up John Thornton, Buck deliberately grabbed his hat and played around. While they were playing, a figure of a white wolf suddenly appeared across the river. John Thornton knew it was inviting Buck to join the fun, and Buck was eager too. John Thornton then only warned Buck to come back early and let it run off with the white wolf toward the distance. But watching the dog-wolf duo walk away side by side, John Thornton couldn't resist his curiosity and quietly followed. Seeing Buck frolicking and playing with its kind, he suddenly understood. As a human, one ultimately needs to return to the community. Escaping is useless and only adds to the suffering of oneself and others. So he decided to leave the next day, to return to his own world and face all the pain and scars. Though Buck was reluctant, both it and John Thornton understood their fate had run its course. From now on, only the distance between worlds remained. To prevent the pain of parting from spreading uncontrollably, John Thornton deliberately kept Buck away, only asking it to come early the next morning to see him off. Unexpectedly, that night, a gunshot shattered the oil lamp in John Thornton's hand, and the wooden house burst into towering flames. Soon after, Hal appeared, shooting through John Thornton's abdomen with a hunting rifle. It turned out that after being expelled from the bar, Hal harbored resentment and searched for John Thornton everywhere. He tracked him to his former residence, finding clues in a map marked with symbols, and finally traced him here. Because of his severe injuries, John Thornton was unable to resist. Hearing the gunshot, Buck arrived just in time to knock the rifle out of Hal's hands. Hal immediately pulled out a wooden stick, unaware that Buck had already become a fierce jungle beast. In the end, Buck pushed Hal into the blazing wooden house, which was consumed by flames. Meanwhile, John Thornton, bleeding heavily, collapsed to the ground. Buck anxiously circled around, finally finding a photo of John Thornton's son, and holding it in his mouth, the master took his last breath. Time passed, and years went by. This group of creatures, strong and healthy, intelligent, brave in battle and fearless. Even more astonishing was that their leader was a canine creature daring to confront a grizzly bear face to face. And Buck, always remembering John Thornton, even though many years have passed since the old friend left, he still remembers those warm palms. Translate apply.